The Grand Hall of Ascendance was built to remind everyone who entered it of one simple truth. Power belonged to the throne. Its ceiling rose so high it vanished into shadow, carved with ancient victories and illuminated by floating glyphs that pulsed in imperial colors. The air itself felt heavy, saturated with centuries of dominance, conquest, and unquestioned authority. Rows of alien nobles sat in ascending tiers, their ornate robes shimmering, their eyes sharp with anticipation. Today was not a day for diplomacy. Today was theater. And at the center of it all stood a single human, alone on the polished obsidian floor, surrounded by an empire that believed it had already won. Princess Althara of the Varelian Empire reclined on her elevated throne, one leg crossed elegantly over the other, her expression calm, confident, and faintly amused. She was young by imperial standards, brilliant by any metric, and raised from birth to believe the galaxy existed in layers with her at the top. To her, this moment was inevitable. The human before her represented a species tolerated only because it was useful. A species allowed a seat in galactic politics only because it filled gaps others found inconvenient. And now, with borders tightening and resources shifting, the Empire had decided it was time to remind humanity of its place. The human ambassador Commander Elias Ward stood silently, hands clasped behind his back, his posture straight but unassuming. He wore no ceremonial armor, no extravagant insignia, only a dark, simple uniform marked with a small, almost modest emblem of the United Human Systems. He had stood in rooms like this before. He had listened to veiled insults disguised as policy concerns, endured laughter masked as diplomacy, and swallowed pride in the name of stability. Today was supposed to be no different, at least. That's what the Empire believed. Princess Althara leaned forward, her voice amplified effortlessly across the hall, smooth and razor-sharp. She spoke of treaties rewritten, of concessions demanded, of borders redrawn without consultation. She spoke of humanity's continued survival as though it were a favor granted, rather than a mutual outcome. Then came the final blow, delivered with deliberate cruelty, designed not just to coerce but to humiliate. She gave him a choice: kneel and formally beg for renewed alliance under harsher terms, or walk away and watch humanity lose trade access, military coordination, and political protection overnight. The court leaned in. This was the moment they had come to witness. Silence followed. Not the awkward kind, not hesitation, but the kind of silence that felt intentional, controlled, and unsettling. Elias did not move. He did not speak. He simply looked up directly at the princess for the first time since entering the hall. There was no anger in his eyes, no desperation, only clarity. Slowly, deliberately, he reached up and removed the insignia from his chest. The soft metallic click echoed far louder than it should have. "I believe," he said calmly, his voice steady and unamplified, yet somehow carrying through the vast hall. "This conversation has reached its natural conclusion." A ripple of confusion passed through the nobles. Princess Althara smiled, certain this was theatrics, a final attempt at leverage. But then Elias turned, not dramatically, not defiantly. He simply turned his back on the throne and began to walk away. No guards moved, no alarms sounded. The doors parted as if recognizing his authority or perhaps his finality. The princess laughed lightly, waving a dismissive hand. "Let him go," she said. "Humans always return when reality sets in." But as the massive doors closed behind him, something shifted, not in the hall but in the galaxy. And no one there yet understood that the moment humanity walked away was the moment everything began to fall apart. For over a century, humanity had survived the galactic stage by mastering a single skill better than any other species: restraint. Where others expanded through conquest, humans expanded through cooperation. Where empires flaunted their fleets and weaponized fear, humanity offered logistics, infrastructure, and stability. To the wider galaxy, Humans were not conquerors. They were facilitators, builders, problem solvers. The ones you called when trade routes collapsed or border skirmishes threatened to spiral into war. Useful, yes, but rarely respected, and certainly never feared. The Varelian Empire, like many others, mistook this restraint for weakness. They studied human lifespans and saw fragility. They observed emotional bonds and assumed rationality. They saw divided governments and mistook debate for indecision. What they never saw, what they never bothered to look for, was the pattern beneath it all. Humanity did not rush. Humanity prepared. Every compromise was recorded. Every concession logged. Every insult remembered, not with anger, but with calculation. The Empire believed it was teaching humans humility. In reality, it was teaching them exactly who could not be trusted. Commander Elias Ward was a product of that philosophy. He was not a politician by ambition, but a strategist by necessity. Before diplomacy, he had served in deep space coordination. During the resource collapse, when three empires nearly destroyed each other over supply lines humanity had quietly been managing for decades, he had seen what happened when human systems were removed. How chaos filled the vacuum faster than anyone predicted. He had also learned something else during those years. No one ever thanked the foundation when the structure stood tall. They only noticed it when it cracked. In the years leading up to the confrontation in the Grand Hall, humanity had begun to change its calculations, not outwardly, not dramatically, but subtly. Redundant trade networks were established. Autonomous defense platforms were repositioned under the guise of research installations. Long-dormant treaties with fringe species were reactivated, quietly, without announcement. Human fleets began training independently again, no longer integrated into imperial command structures. And all of it was done with the same calm professionalism the galaxy had come to associate with harmless cooperation. The Empire noticed none of it. Princess Althara, for all her intelligence, was raised inside a narrative that had never been challenged. Humans were junior partners, temporary allies, tools to be leveraged, not equals to be respected. When advisors warned her that humanity's data sharing had decreased, she dismissed it as bureaucratic inefficiency. When merchants complained of delays routed through human-controlled lanes, she assumed it was pressure tactics that would collapse under threat. After all, humans needed the Empire's markets. Humans needed protection. Humans needed approval. What she failed to understand was that humans had already run the numbers and approval was no longer worth the cost. By the time Elias stood in that hall, the decision had already been made back on Earth. The ultimatum was never going to work because humanity had already accepted the outcome. The Empire thought it was pushing a dependent species into submission. In truth, it was pushing a strategist to finally stand up and walk away from a table that no longer served him. And while the galaxy continued to see humans as quiet, polite, and compliant, the illusion held right up until the moment it shattered, because the greatest mistake the Varelian Empire ever made was believing that the species holding everything together had nothing to lose. The first shockwave did not come in the form of fleets or weapons. It came as silence. Within hours of Commander Elias Ward's departure from the Grand Hall, human channels went dark, not abruptly, not dramatically, but completely. No diplomatic protests, no emergency summits, no carefully worded appeals for reconsideration. The Varelian Empire waited for the predictable response: frantic negotiations, back-channel compromises, perhaps a public statement designed to soothe markets and reassure allies. Instead, there was nothing, and for an empire accustomed to controlling narratives, that absence was profoundly unsettling. At first, the imperial court dismissed it as posturing. Human governments were famously slow, famously divided, surely. Debate was raging behind closed doors, surely cooler heads would prevail. Princess Althara herself convened a private council, confident this was merely the quiet before concession. She spoke of patience, of allowing humans time to recognize their miscalculation. Yet even as she spoke, reports began to arrive, small anomalies easily ignored in isolation, but troubling when viewed together. Trade shipments routed through human logistics hubs were delayed indefinitely. Navigation data once freely shared now required authorization that never came. Repair docks, operated by human contractors across imperial space, closed their bays simultaneously, citing internal restructuring. The Empire had never realized how deeply humanity was embedded in its infrastructure. Humans rarely owned territory outright, rarely planted flags or demanded tribute. Instead, they positioned themselves everywhere quietly in supply chains, transit coordination, maintenance systems, emergency response frameworks. They were the grease in the machinery of empire, invisible when present, catastrophic when removed. And now, piece by piece, that machinery began to grind. Princess Althara summoned Elias Ward's successor only to learn there was none. The human embassy had been vacated, not abandoned in haste, but methodically shut down. Files archived, equipment removed, even the plants were gone. It was as if humanity had erased itself from the room without leaving a single fingerprint behind. For the first time since ascending the throne, Althara felt something unfamiliar crawl up her spine, not fear, not yet but uncertainty. Across the wider galaxy, other powers noticed the shift faster. Independent trade leagues reported sudden instability in routes, once considered the safest in known space. Minor species dependent on human mediation found themselves exposed to predatory neighbors. Overnight, and quietly, almost imperceptibly, alliances began to realign. Fringe civilizations that had long been dismissed as insignificant suddenly found human envoys arriving, not to negotiate from weakness, but from choice. Humanity was not retreating. It was repositioning. On Earth, the withdrawal had been planned years in advance, not as an act of aggression, but as a contingency in answer to a question humanity had asked itself long ago. What happens when cooperation is mistaken for submission? The answer was unfolding exactly as predicted. Human networks shifted inward. Autonomous systems activated. Fleets that had not moved in decades slipped free of shared command protocols and returned to independent operation. No announcements were made, no threats issued. Humanity simply stopped asking permission. The Empire tried to respond with pressure. Sanctions were announced loudly and publicly, meant to humiliate and intimidate. But they landed on a world already prepared. Human economies adjusted overnight, rerouting resources through internal systems and alternative partners. The markets did not crash, they stabilized. That alone sent a ripple of unease through the Imperial Senate. This was not how a dependent species behaved. This was not how desperation looked. Princess Althara began to realize the depth of her miscalculation, not through grand events, but through small humiliations. Requests went unanswered. Ultimatums expired without acknowledgement. Even her personal message, carefully worded, deliberately private, was returned unopened. For the first time in her life, she was not being defied. She was being ignored. And in galactic politics, nothing was more dangerous than irrelevance. What the Empire still did not see, what it could not yet imagine, was that humanity had not left the table to sulk. It had left to build a new one, and soon the galaxy would be forced to choose where it wished to sit, because when humans stop negotiating, it's never because they've run out of options. The first real fracture inside the Varelian Empire did not occur on a battlefield or in the Senate chamber, but in a place no one thought to look: logistics. 3 cycles after humanity's withdrawal, a core sector relay station failed to receive its scheduled maintenance update. Normally, this would have been inconsequential. Backup systems would compensate, human technicians would patch the gap remotely, and the report would be archived without ceremony. This time, there were no technicians. No patch arrived within hours. Routing errors cascaded across neighboring sectors, trade convoys drifted off optimal paths, and the civilian carriers were forced to emergency drop from faster-than-light transit to avoid catastrophic collision. The Empire issued statements blaming unexpected technical irregularities, but internally, analysts began to whisper a word that had not been spoken seriously in generations: dependency. Princess Althara read the internal briefings in silence, her expression carefully composed. Though each line chipped away at her certainty, the numbers were undeniable. Nearly 40% of Imperial transit optimization relied on human-author predictive models. More than half of deep space emergency response protocols have been standardized by human-led coalitions. Even the Empire's vaunted military readiness metrics, once believed entirely sovereign, were calibrated against human-supplied simulations. Humanity had never demanded control. It had simply offered competence, and the Empire had accepted it without question. Now the competence was gone, and the void it left behind was wider than anyone had anticipated. The Senate convened an emergency session, though the word emergency was never spoken aloud. Pride demanded restraint, yet voices that had once mocked human restraint now cracked with unease. Lesser nobles began demanding reinstatement of diplomatic channels. Military strategists proposed demonstrative patrols near human-aligned systems, only to discover that updated star charts previously maintained by human cartographers were no longer accessible. Even the most hawkish among them felt the ground shifting beneath their feet. You could not intimidate what you could not track. Meanwhile, humanity moved with a calm that bordered on unsettling. Far from retreating into isolation, human representatives appeared in regions the Empire had long neglected: frontier systems, disputed corridors, forgotten worlds written off as unprofitable. They did not arrive with fleets or threats. They arrived with engineers, educators, and mediators. Where the Empire extracted, humans stabilized. Where the Empire ruled by decree, humans negotiated mutual benefit slowly, almost invisibly. Trust realigned, and trust, as the Empire was beginning to relearn, was power that could not be seized back by force. On Earth, Commander Elias Ward stood before a council that no longer debated whether the Empire had erred. That question was settled. The discussion now centered on response philosophy. There were voices calling for leverage, for calculated pressure, for forcing the Empire to the table on humanity's terms. Ward listened, then spoke with the same measured calm that had defined his departure. "They're waiting for us to push," he said. "They expect punishment. They expect retaliation. If we give them that, we confirm their worldview. If we don't, we rewrite it." And so humanity continued to do nothing, at least. Nothing visible, no grand declarations, no dramatic ultimatums. The silence stretched, heavy and deliberate, allowing the Empire's own systems to expose their fragility, allowing allies to notice who had truly been holding the galaxy together, allowing Princess Althara, alone in her chambers, to confront a truth no royal education had prepared her for. Power taken for granted decays faster than power defended. Her advisors urged her to act, to summon fleets, to remind the humans of their place. But she hesitated. Somewhere beneath her pride, beneath her training, a doubt had taken root. Elias Ward had not left in anger. He had left in certainty. And certainty, she was beginning to understand, was the most dangerous weapon of all. Because the galaxy was no longer asking whether humanity would return. It was beginning to ask whether the Empire would survive long enough to matter when they did. The turning point did not arrive with alarms or invasions, but with a quiet vote that passed almost unnoticed beyond the outer halls of the Virelian Senate, a minor coalition of mid-tier systems worlds that had never mattered much in Imperial calculus formally withdrew from an Empire-backed trade accord and announced a bilateral framework with human-aligned networks instead. On paper, it was insignificant. In reality, it was seismic. Those systems controlled junction points, that fed raw materials into 3 imperial manufacturing chains, and within days, production schedules across the core worlds began to slip. Shipyards missed deadlines, defense contracts stalled, civilian unrest flared in places that had not known shortages in generations. For the first time, the Empire felt what it was like to be dependent on goodwill rather than command. Princess Althara watched the situation unravel through layers of filtered reports, each advisor softening the language just enough to avoid blame. Yet the pattern was impossible to ignore. Everywhere humans disengaged, instability followed. Everywhere humans engaged elsewhere, stability bloomed. They were not rallying armies against the Empire. They were making it optional. The realization struck harder than any threat ever could. Empires could survive enemies. They struggled to survive irrelevance against council. Althara ordered a deep review of historical records concerning humanity's early integration into galactic affairs. What she found unsettled her. Humans had never demanded parity, never. Subtitles never insisted on ceremonial recognition. They had accepted subordinate seating, advisory roles, temporary mandates. They had smiled, complied, and worked. And while others competed for status, humans had built redundancy backup systems, parallel routes, independent frameworks, not as preparation for conquest, but as insurance against exactly this moment. They had planned for betrayal not because they expected it, but because their history taught them that power structures always tested loyalty eventually. The princess recalled Elias Ward's expression when he turned to leave the Grand Hall. Not anger, not heartbreak, disappointment, the kind reserved not for enemies, but for partners who had failed a basic test of character. That memory now followed her through sleepless cycles. For the first time, she questioned the lesson drilled into her since childhood that authority was proven by making others bend. What if authority, real authority, was proven by those who stayed even when they didn't have to? The Empire attempted a show of strength, a fleet maneuvered near a human-adjacent corridor. Perfectly legal, perfectly measured. The response came 12 hours later, not from a battleship, but from a notice. Human-civilian traffic rerouted instantly. Insurance coverage for Imperial vessels in shared space was suspended. Navigation advisories reclassified the corridor as non-essential. No confrontation occurred. No weapons powered up. And yet the message was unmistakable. Escalation would be expensive, and humans would not be paying the bill. Behind closed doors, the Senate fractured. Traditionalists demanded decisive action before the perception of weakness spread further. Pragmatists warned that force would only accelerate humanity's disengagement. For the first time in centuries, the Empire had no consensus and no external stabilizer to help it find one. Humans had often played that role quietly, mediating disputes, smoothing over ideological rifts. Without them, old rivalries resurfaced with alarming speed. Princess Althara finally did what no ruler before her had dared. She drafted a message not as a sovereign issuing terms, but as an individual acknowledging fault. It was never sent. Her advisors argued it would be seen as weakness, as humiliation, as surrender. She listened, then dismissed them all. Alone, she stared at the unsigned transmission and realized the cruel irony of her position. She had demanded a human beg because she believed it would affirm her strength. Instead, his departure had revealed how much of that strength had been borrowed, and somewhere far beyond imperial borders, humanity continued building a future that did not require her permission. One system, one alliance, one quiet decision at a time. The transmission Princess Althara finally sent was not the one she had drafted in anger, nor the one her advisors had polished into something unrecognizable. It was shorter, plainer, stripped of imperial language and ceremonial framing. It carried no demands, no veiled threats, no reminder of titles or lineage. It acknowledged, without apology but without pride, that the Empire had misjudged both humanity's intent and its value. It did not ask Commander Elias Ward to return. It asked whether dialogue was still possible. And when the message was released into the quantum relay, it felt less like diplomacy and more like confession. The reply did not come quickly. In fact, it did not come at all, not in the way the Empire expected. There was no direct response from Ward, no official communique from Earth, no reassuring signal that bridges could be rebuilt with a few carefully chosen words. Instead, the galaxy answered. Another cluster of neutral systems formally exited Imperial oversight and aligned themselves with human cooperative frameworks. A joint research consortium announced breakthroughs achieved without Imperial funding. A border dispute that had simmered for decades resolved peacefully under human mediation. Bypassing the Empire entirely, each event, taken alone, was manageable together. They painted a future where the Varelian Empire was no longer central. Inside the Imperial capital, the psychological impact was devastating. Citizens had been raised to believe the Empire was synonymous with order, that without it, chaos would reign. Now they watched order emerge elsewhere, efficient, voluntary, and notably free of Imperial oversight. Confidence eroded, questions surfaced, and questions, once allowed, proved impossible to contain. Why had humans been treated as expendable? Why had their contributions been minimized? Why had the Empire assumed loyalty without offering respect? Princess Althara felt the weight of history settle on her shoulders. She was no longer reacting to a diplomatic incident. She was presiding over a reckoning. The Empire's greatest mistake had not been insulting a human representative. It had been misunderstanding humanity's definition of power. Humans did not dominate to be feared. They collaborated to be indispensable. And when that collaboration was rejected, they did not fight to reclaim relevance, they simply took it. With them, on Earth, Elias Ward read the princess's message in silence, then archived it without comment. Not out of spite, but because the decision had already been made. Humanity would not return to a table where respect was conditional. If dialogue resumed someday, it would be between equals, not patrons and dependents. Until then, the galaxy would adjust. It always did, and adjust it did. Markets stabilized around new hubs. Security coalitions formed without Imperial command. Educational exchanges flourished, centered on human institutions once dismissed as peripheral. The Empire was not collapsing, but it was shrinking, slowly and unmistakably, as gravity shifted. Elsewhere, Princess Althara stood alone on the palace balcony, watching traffic lanes thin against the stars. She finally understood the cruelty of her original demand. Begging had never been the issue. The real test had been whether the Empire deserved partnership. And in that moment, with the galaxy moving on without her, she realized the answer had already been given, not by humans, but by the silence they left behind. Because the most devastating response humanity ever delivered was not anger or war or revenge. It was proving that they were never dependent at all. By the time Princess Althara recognized that the Empire was no longer at the center of events, it was already reacting instead of leading. A position no Varelian ruler had occupied in recorded history. Reports no longer spoke of temporary disruptions or external market noise. They spoke of trends, of permanent shifts, of younger generations and border systems choosing human educational standards over imperial academies, not out of rebellion, but out of practicality. Of merchants rerouting contracts not because they hated the Empire, but because human frameworks were faster, fairer, and most unforgivable of all optional. Power that required consent, Althara realized late, was power people defended willingly. Power that relied on obligation decayed the moment obedience was no longer profitable. The princess began holding audiences without advisors, listening directly to envoys from worlds that had once competed for imperial favor. What she heard unsettled her more than open defiance ever could. They spoke respectfully, calmly. They thanked the Empire for centuries of stability and then explained with quiet finality. Why they no longer needed it. Human systems did not demand loyalty oaths. Human alliances did not punish dissent. Humans negotiated exit clauses before agreements were ever signed. To an empire built on permanence and hierarchy, such flexibility looked like weakness. Now it was clear it had been foresight. At night, Althara replayed the moment Elias Ward had turned away from her throne. She finally understood why he had not argued, threatened, or pleaded. He had known the Empire's reaction would follow a familiar script: pressure, pride, escalation. Humans had already lived through that cycle on their own world, again and again. They had learned the lesson painfully. When respect is absent, departure is the only leverage that does not corrupt you. Ward had not left to punish her. He had left to preserve something humanity refused to compromise. Dignity. The Empire attempted reform. Too late, but sincerely. Trade councils were restructured. Titles were offered retroactively to human representatives who had already moved on. Apologies were drafted, revised, softened, strengthened, then delayed into irrelevance. The galaxy had not been waiting. New norms were forming without imperial input. And once norms stabilized, they were notoriously resistant to reversal. The Empire was discovering a brutal truth. You could not apologize your way back into indispensability. In one final act of defiance against her own advisors, Princess Althara ordered the archives open to the public. Records of human contributions, once classified or minimized, were released unedited. The effect was immediate and volatile. Citizens saw, many for the first time, how often human intervention had prevented famine, de-escalated wars, and stabilized economies without ever demanding credit. Outrage erupted, not at humans, but at the Empire's leadership for squandering such a partnership. For the first time, the princess was not blamed personally. She was pitied, and that, more than condemnation, hollowed her resolve. Across human-aligned space, the story was being told differently, not as a triumph, but as a cautionary tale. Humans did not celebrate the Empire's decline. They recorded it, studied it, taught it, a reminder to themselves of why they had chosen cooperation over conquest, and why they walked away the moment cooperation became conditional. Humanity was not interested in ruling the galaxy. It was interested in never being trapped by it. On the balcony once more, Althara watched a human convoy pass at the edge of Imperial space unescorted, unchallenged. Moving with effortless confidence, she finally grasped the full weight of her mistake. She had expected a man to beg so that she could feel powerful. Instead, he had left, and in doing so, had shown her what real power looked like. Not domination, not submission, but the ability to walk away and be followed. The Empire would endure. Empires often did, but it would never again mistake presence for loyalty or silence for weakness. And Princess Althara would rule with the knowledge that some doors, once closed by pride, were not reopened by regret, only remembered as lessons written across the stars. The moment Princess Althara realized the Empire had truly lost humanity did not come during a council session or a public address, but during a routine diplomatic briefing that should have been forgettable. A junior aide, nervous and clearly unprepared to deliver the news, reported that a newly formed interstellar forum composed of neutral systems, frontier worlds, and several former imperial dependencies had unanimously voted to adopt human mediation standards as their default framework, not temporarily, permanently. The Empire had not been invited to observe, consult, or object. It was not even mentioned in the final declaration. The room fell silent, not with shock, but with something far worse: recognition. Princess Althara dismissed the aide and remained seated long after the chamber emptied. For the first time, there was no one left to advise her, flatter her, or soften reality. The truth stood unguarded. Humanity had not undermined the Empire through rebellion or war. It had simply offered a better alternative, and the galaxy had chosen it freely. That choice she now understood, was irreversible. You could reconquer territory, you could suppress dissent, but you could not force people to believe in you again once they had seen something better. She ordered one final review of humanity's departure timeline, hoping against reason to find a moment where the outcome might have changed. There was none. From the instant she demanded Elias Ward beg, the path had been locked. Humans had not left in anger. They had left with clarity. And clarity, unlike pride, did not fade with time. In private, Althara recorded a message that would never be broadcast. It was not an apology meant for history, nor a justification meant for legacy. It was a confession meant only for herself. She admitted she had confused authority with worth, obedience with loyalty, and silence with weakness. She admitted that she had believed dignity was something she could grant or withhold. And she admitted that when Elias Ward turned away, he had taken something with him that no fleet could recover: the Empire's illusion of inevitability. Across human-aligned space, Elias Ward watched the galaxy stabilize without imperial gravity. Trade flowed, conflicts de-escalated, cooperation emerged not because humans enforced it, but because they had designed systems that worked even when trust was fragile. When asked whether humanity would ever return to the imperial table, Ward's answer was simple: only if we're invited as equals, not symbols, not tools. The princess never sent another message, because deep down, she understood the cruelest truth of all. The Empire had not lost humanity. It had revealed it never truly had them. Years later, long after the crisis had settled into history, cadets at Human Academy studied the moment not as a triumph, but as a warning. The lesson was never framed around Princess Althara or imperial decline. It centered on Elias Ward's decision to leave without arguing. Instructors emphasized that he had not raised his voice, threatened consequences, or appealed to emotion. He had simply recognized the moment, respect, and chosen dignity over access. In imperial space, the story was taught differently. Children learned of the quiet fracture, the era when the Empire discovered that power was not something you could assume would stay one turn. Princess Althara ruled until the end of her natural life, overseeing reforms that slowly reshaped imperial culture. The Empire survived leaner, humbler, more cautious. It never again demanded loyalty without offering respect. Some lessons, it seemed, had been learned permanently. Elias Ward never held high office again. He declined honors, refused monuments, and returned to civilian life quietly. When asked in a rare interview whether he regretted walking away from the most powerful empire in known space, he paused for a long moment before answering. No, he said, because if I had stayed, we would have taught them the wrong lesson. And worse, we would have taught ourselves one. The galaxy remembered him not as a conqueror, not as a revolutionary, but as the man who proved something no fleet ever could: that the greatest strength humanity possessed was not its technology, its resilience, or its unity. It was the ability to walk away and still be followed.